Senator from Kentucky.
I move to discharge S.J. Res. 31 from the Foreign Relations Committee.
The motion is pending.
I'd also like to ask unanimous consent that Anthony Charletta, an intern of my office, be granted floor privileges until December 17th, 2021.
Without objection.
One cause of famine and starvation is war. Saudi Arabia's air and naval blockade of Yemen has led to thousands and thousands of deaths in Yemen from lack of food and medicine. The U.S. should end all arms sales to the Saudis until they end their blockade of Yemen. President Biden said he would change the Trump policy of supporting Saudi's war in Yemen, but it's not all that apparent that policy has changed. Today, we challenge the Biden administration's sale of $650 million worth of arms, including air-to-air missiles, to Yemen. Just 2 months ago, the Biden administration approved $500 million worth of arms, including maintenance for attack helicopters that are used in Yemen. Now, some want to differentiate offensive weapons from defensive weapons, but really, even defensive weapons can be used to allow a country to absorb attacks in order to continue their offensive operations. The real question is not an artificial designation of weapons as offensive or defensive, but whether Congress is serious about using the leverage of arms sales or of withholding arms sales to end the blockade in Yemen. That the Biden administration continues to reward Saudi Arabia with weapons seems to indicate that President Biden is not really serious about withholding arms sales to end the war in Yemen. Indeed, if this administration were serious about ending the Saudi blockade, they could do one thing, and this thing would end the war tomorrow, would end the blockade tomorrow. The Saudis, I think, would immediately stop the blockade if this administration would stop sending spare parts, stop fixing the planes. Bruce Riedel of Brookings writes that the Saudi Air Force would be grounded in short order if we quit sending them spare parts, quit repairing their aircraft. We could stop this war if we rarely had the will to do it. All America should be appalled at the humanitarian disaster caused by the Saudi blockade of Yemen. For years now, ships would otherwise carry food, fuel, and medicine are turned away by the Saudi-led coalition, depriving the Yemeni people of the necessities to sustain civilization. Yemen's one of the poorest countries on the planet. They have to import their food. The blockade is killing their children. Saudi Arabia's intervention in the Yemeni civil war is a chilling example of the cruelty of warfare by starvation. According to the United Nations, in Yemen, 5 million people are one step away from succumbing to famine and disease, and 10 million more are right behind them. We can start the process of ending this crisis by enacting this resolution of disapproval. The children of Yemen who survived Saudi's barbaric blockade will inevitably tell their sons and daughters of the horrors of their youth, and those sons and daughters will tell their sons and daughters. Through oral tradition, 1,000 generations of Yemenis will know of the Crown Prince's ruthlessness, and they will also know that it was the Americans that sold the weapons to wage this murderous campaign. The reports from Yemen are literally a nightmare. The Washington Post reported recently of a 3-year-old boy who cannot walk or speak, who weighs 10 pounds. A 3-year-old boy who weighs 10 pounds. The images are grotesque. His face is skeletal. His arms and legs are thin as twigs. He weighs 10 pounds. His father says that he sometimes goes days without any food. And we are complicit. We are arming the Saudis and allowing this to happen. Offensive, defensive, they shouldn't get any of our weapons. We should stop selling them any weapons until they stop starving the country of Yemen. The New York Times tells the story of a mother who, after 3 days of failing to get a ride, carried her 8-month-old while walking 2 hours to reach medics. to treat the kids her child's acute malnutrition. But even after a week of treatment with enriched formula, the boy still lay motionless on his hospital bed. Tens of thousands of children have already died from disease and malnutrition from this war, and we should not be complicit. We should not be aiding the Saudis. International aid agencies, who also have to fight the Saudi blockade to provide assistance, put it this way: the people of Yemen are not starving, they are being starved. The Saudi siege of Yemen is made possible because of American weaponry. The arsenal provided by the United States includes billions of dollars worth of military aircraft and thousands of air-to-ground munitions. Only weeks ago, the Biden administration approved a new $650 million sale of 280 advanced medium air-to-air missiles and 596 missile launchers. As painful as it is to admit, the United States is an accessory to this Saudi savagery. President Biden says the latest sale is merely to help defend Saudi territorial integrity. But the commander-in-chief's words do not match Saudi actions. According to William Hartung, the director of the Arms and Security Program for the Center for International Policy, the air blockade is enforced by a threat to shoot down any aircraft, military or civilian, that enters Yemeni airspace. The provision of air-to-air missiles gives further credibility to this threat, dissuading any government or aid group from bringing in crucial medicines or flying patients in and out of Yemen. These weapons are not purely defensive. They are used as a threat to any aircraft that brings aid into Yemen, and they are part of the blockade, they are part of the problem, and it is our leverage. These weapons belong to the American people. They may be made by private companies, but they are owned by the American people because we commissioned these weapons, and we should not give them to countries who are starving children and are committing essentially genocide in Yemen. In other words, no weapon is exclusively defensive, and continuing arms sales means continued death and starvation in Yemen. We must end America's complicity in Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen people, on the Yemeni people. If you believe in humanitarianism, if you believe America is a force for good that serves as a model for other nations to emulate, if you believe that the crushing of the Yemeni people must be stopped, then you must vote for this resolution of disapproval. We have a chance to tell the Crown Prince that American arms sales will end until he gives up his starvation campaign. We can end the Saudi blockade and bring relief to the long-suffering people of Yemen. Should we fail to seize this opportunity, history will not let us forget that America, the last best hope for humanity, failed to protect defenseless civilians from the cruelty of a criminal regime. Thank you.
Senator from Vermont.
President, I find myself in the somewhat uncomfortable and unusual position of agreeing with Senator Paul. And let me thank him and Senator Lee for their hard work in reclaiming Congress's congressional war powers, another very important issue. The understanding that it is Congress that has the constitutional responsibility to authorize war, not the President, should in fact transcend partisan disagreements. On November 18th, we introduced a congressional resolution of disapproval to block the sale of 280 air-to-air missiles, 596 missile launches, and other weapons and support totaling some $650 million to Saudi Arabia. And that is what we will be voting on in a few minutes. Let me be very clear. As the Saudi government continues to wage its devastating war in Yemen and repress its own people, we should not be rewarding them with more arms sales. We should be demanding that they end the devastating war in Yemen, which has killed over 230,000 people in one of the very poorest countries on earth. For more than 6 years, the Saudi-led military intervention in Yemen's civil war has been a key driver of the largest humanitarian disaster in the world, the largest. According to UNICEF, 4 out of every 5 children in Yemen needs humanitarian assistance. That is over 11 million children. 400,000 children suffer from severe malnutrition. 1.7 million children have been displaced from their homes by violence from this war. And some 15 million people, more than half of whom are children, do not have access to safe water, sanitation, or hygiene. United Nations Humanitarian Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths said in September, and I quote, "The country's economy has reached new depths of collapse, and a third wave of the pandemic is threatening to crash the country's already fragile healthcare system," end quote. According to Griffiths, millions of Yemenis are a step away from starvation. In other words, this poor country is hell on earth. It is the worst humanitarian disaster on a planet. Under first the Obama administration and then the Trump administration, the United States was Saudi Arabia's partner in this horrific war. In 2019, Congress made history, and I'm very proud of that, and we did this in a bipartisan way, by passing the first ever War Powers resolution through both chambers of Congress, pressing then-President Trump to end this military support. It marked the first time that Congress invoked the War Powers resolution of 1973 to direct the President to withdraw troops from an undeclared war. Sadly, tragically, President Trump vetoed that resolution. Many of us welcomed the Biden administration's announcement earlier this year that it would end U.S. support for offensive military operations led by Saudi Arabia in Yemen and name a special envoy to help bring this conflict to an end. But the crisis has only continued. American defense contractors continue to service Saudi planes that are waging the war, and the United States military also continues to provide intelligence to the Saudi armed forces. And now, tonight, we are looking at a new $650 million arms sale to the Saudi armed forces. Now, I am aware that ending U.S. military support for Saudi Arabia's brutal assault will not alone end the multi-sided conflict in Yemen. The Houthis are launching bloody attacks on the central Yemeni city of Marib and increasing cross-border attacks on Saudi territory. Violence has also erupted between rival factions in the south of Yemen. A UN expert panel found that all parties to the conflict may have committed war crimes. U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia and this war should be clear. The United States must do everything in our power to bring this brutal and horrific war to an end. Exporting more missiles to Saudi Arabia does nothing but further this conflict and pour more gasoline on already raging fire. In my view, the United States must support an international observer mission along the Saudi-Yemeni border and spearhead generous international development efforts to rebuild Yemen. This aid should be focused on bolstering local humanitarian and development initiatives like Yemen's Social Fund for Development. We must also dramatically increase our diplomatic engagement to press Saudi Arabia, the Riyadh-based Republic of Yemen government, and the Houthis to accept the UN's roadmap as the basis for a compromise that ends foreign military intervention and allows Yemenis to come to an agreement. The war has gone on for too long, and it's time for the United States to be bold and to be decisive in bringing about peace. Mr. President, I also think that it is long past time that we took a very hard look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia, a country whose government represents the very opposite of what we profess to believe in. Saudi Arabia is an extremely undemocratic country that is run by a hereditary authoritarian monarchy, one of the wealthiest families in the world, whose wealth is estimated to be over $1.4 trillion. Mr. President, at a time when children in Yemen are starving to death, when that impoverished country's healthcare system is collapsing, when the people of Gaza are suffering mass unemployment and environmental devastation, when people throughout that region lack clean drinking water, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman bought himself a $500 million yacht, a $300 million French chateau, and a $450 million Leonardo da Vinci painting. Mass starvation in the region that he helped create. Children do not have housing or drinking water, and this guy buys himself a $450 million Da Vinci painting. According to Freedom House, a respected human rights organization, and I quote, Saudi Arabia's absolute monarchy restricts almost all political rights and civil liberties. No officials at the national level are elected. The regime relies on pervasive surveillance, the criminalization of dissent, appeals to sectarianism and ethnicity, and public spending supported by oil revenues to maintain power. Women and religious minorities face extensive discrimination in law and in practice, end quote. Freedom House also notes that working conditions for the large migrant labor force are extremely exploitative. Saudi Arabia is home to millions of migrant workers, many from African countries, but also from Pakistan, India, and elsewhere. These workers constitute more than 80% of the private sector workforce, often as laborers and other service workers. They are governed by an abusive system that gives their employers excessive power over their mobility and legal status in the country. As a result, these migrant workers are vulnerable to a wide range of abuses, from passport confiscation to delayed wages and forced labor. According to Human Rights Watch, under the government headed by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, quote, Saudi Arabia has experienced the worst period of repression in its modern history, end quote. Human Rights Watch reported earlier this year that, quote, accounts have emerged of alleged torture of high-profile political detainees in Saudi prisons, end quote, including Saudi women's rights activists and others. The alleged torture included electric shocks, beatings, whippings, and sexual harassment. And I think we all understand the nature of this government. Every member of Congress, and I hope every American, knows, and our own intelligence services made this very clear, that Mohammed bin Salman himself ordered the murder and the dismemberment of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 in retaliation for Khashoggi's criticisms of the Saudi regime. We all remember that terrible, terrible murder of a Washington Post columnist. We also know that the Saudi regime has waged a campaign of harassment and attempted kidnapping against other critics, including on U.S. soil. Mr. President, my simple question is, why in the world would the United States reward such a regime which has caused such pain in Yemen with more weapons? My friends, the answer is we should not. I urge my colleagues to support SJ Res 31. Thank you, Mr. President.